broadly, we're here to talk a little bit about how we arrived at the case study, what it's meant to do, and some thoughts on it, hopefully to stimulate a bit of discussion later on today. And in terms of doing that, really to talk you through what was the logic behind it, which I think Neil was going to just fill you in on.
Yeah, so I suppose why we're here, previous speakers have certainly covered that very well. Huge pressure on the majority of the sector. But what we really wanted to do was to explore what farmers can do, but by connecting them with those from outside the farm gate to see if there's anything we can learn from those other businesses operating out with the sector, but also whether they can maybe learn anything from what we do, because we're certainly not here to say that agriculture and farming doesn't know what it's doing. There's some fantastic things and some fantastic innovations going on farm that don't get shared in the wider business circle either. So I think that was the basis of what we were trying to do, and taking on from what James Walker did in Australia. The basis of that was the case study. So Rob, can you just flip on to the next slide? And I think, Rob, you were just going to cover kind of main issues that we're seeing at the moment on farm when you and I go out.
The issue about farm profitability has been raised already this morning. You know, we've seen great swings. We've seen businesses suddenly go from having decent milk prices and reasonable profits. We've got a year where a large proportion of dairy farmers will be probably making substantial losses. And it's how we address that, really, and how farmers can start to look at addressing improving profitability on farm. And I think, you know, it is about trying to get people to think long and hard about where they're at and what we need to do. I think we're seeing quite a lot of issues with succession, which is a big driver on farms, and potentially, you know, you're never quite sure whether profitability or succession is really the problem. You know, time after time, if you've got very profitable businesses, it's generally quite easy to find successors and encourage them to come into it. But if you've got businesses that aren't generating enough profit, then it's much more difficult to find those people to come in and succeed. And that's probably driven by management issues, which is also being discussed by William and other people earlier. You know, whether within the dairy sector and on farms generally, is management of those units up to scratch? You know, we're all aware, and Neil's alluded to some fantastic businesses that work very well, but you know, there's a lot of businesses that probably could do a little bit more. So it's how we improve that. What are the hurdles? What we need to do. So they were the sort of issues that we were looking at in putting the case study together and trying to pull out and sort of put a position forward that would force people to look at them.
So you've all had it. I think you all got it at the tail end of last week. There was emails went out. There's another copy in your pack today. So what does the farm actually represent? Well, you know, Rob and I are very privileged to see probably 200-300 farm businesses each every year, and even more privileged that we get to see their inner workings in terms of family dynamics and financial discussions, all predominantly still around the kitchen table. Which is great for me, not so good for the belly, unfortunately. And when we look at these things, you know, we start looking at the people in this case. You know, we've got Robert and Heather Kidworth. No idea where we come up with the Robert and Heather from, but that's the original thinking of this group. In our mind, it probably makes a fairly typical family farming unit. Mum and dad working in the business with support from children, but with interesting dynamics around the competition from those children to actually become part of the business. And on what terms are they going to become part of the business? You know, is it just going to be handed to somebody on a plate to just go on and take it through from the next generation as it's always been? What happens in this case, where there's 3 children, seems to be a couple of them interested in some way, shape or form, you know, and another child that's maybe away from the farm. But as tends to happen in certainly family farming businesses, Robert and Heather Kidworth will want to be fair, in inverted commas. The big question is, should they be fair? Do they have to be fair? You know, they might want to be, but actually what problems does that give to the next generation coming through with mum and dad going down this route of being fair? Rob, do you want to talk a little bit just about the farm and the finances and how we came to them?
I think broadly we were looking for something that represented most of the businesses that we see, or a large proportion of businesses that we see that we think are probably the ones that need these issues covering. And it's very typical. It's a sort of owner-occupier farm, a couple of 100 acres, 150, 170 cows, as Neil's alluded to, mainly family labour. There's a lot of these businesses kicking about, and they've, probably ticked over quite nicely. We all know, we'll all know several of them as neighbours, as farms that you drive past. So there's a lot of them about. It's probably a farm that's been driven by, use the word tradition, but not probably in a sort of derogatory sense, in that people have strived to expand, pushed on cow numbers a little bit, taken opportunities when lands come up, because generally that's what's driven farms growing, and that's how it's grown. It's reasonable land, good, reasonable setup, buildings probably dated, still an awful lot of dairy businesses running out of buildings that probably went up in the 70s under an FHDS scheme, which fortunately I'm not old enough to remember. But there's a lot of those buildings that are probably past the sell-by date, and some of these businesses probably have to think long and hard about where that investment will come from. In terms of the finances, we've used the figures and based the figures around the sort of average numbers that I see in our accountancy practice over the last sort of 7 or 8 years. So they're sort of fairly representative of what we see day to day on average farms. I think the key thing that comes out of it is if you look at the period from sort of 2009-10 through to today, that business hasn't really ever generated any money out of its dairy business. They've ticked over. They've had good years when they've made quite a bit of money, and they've had the odd bad year for whatever reason. 2012-13 was pretty grim for most people because of weather, and 15-16 looks like it'll be pretty grim because of milk prices. But when you look at the year, we're in a volatile market, but if you look after year, pretty much at the start and end of that 7 or 8 year period, the capital that the farmers have from farming is pretty much identical. And we see it making a little bit of profit, but by the time it's lived, had its holiday, a little bit of drawings, paid a bit of a tax bill, it's not actually making any progress. And these are probably the businesses that we're looking at now and thinking, well, are they going to make the step to go forward, or are they going to actually start to wither on the vine, which we need to understand, I think. So that's broadly where we were looking at coming from with the case study.
And as you'll have noticed, the business borrows a little bit of money, but in the grand scheme of things, it's not particularly highly geared. I think as well, from a bank perspective, those are, because they borrow money, the bank will actually see those businesses on a regular basis. But there's around about half of this agricultural industry doesn't actually borrow any money. I sense that we're getting to a point in some of the sectors, even if they haven't borrowed money in the past, they might be starting to look to do so now, just to keep cash flow going. But from a bank's perspective, I'd be interested to know, from those businesses that sit in credit, the bank probably certainly spend a lot less time on them because they don't borrow, and actually some of the input of that's going to be interesting to see as well, because there's probably half of those businesses out there. Maybe speak to Rob once a year to sort out their tax. What other advice are they getting put into that equation? So Rob's put the questions up. You'll all have seen them. And now these questions are really challenges for you. We don't have the answers, although in the bar last night I was pinned by a couple of people to say you must have the answers. We don't. That's why we're all here, and that is why we will be launching the case study as a wider competition. So there are challenges for you, but certainly the Agrihive team are more than happy. In fact, we positively invite your thoughts and feelings on this matter, even if they don't relate necessarily to these questions. You might want to write a little bit. You might want to give us a thesis on it. We are open to everything, because this, for us, is open house. This is, let's get as many ideas out from you guys in the room, but also the guys watching on the live stream. And then when we launch this wider case study, anybody and everybody we can get to talk to. Hey, Rob, you get anything you want to add on the questions? Stuff. Okay, so in terms of the case study competition, open to absolutely everyone. The entire global farming and business communities are invited to take part, and we'll look forward to reading your submissions. And everybody in this room, if you can get as many of your peers and friends and colleagues to look at it and give us some thoughts, that would be fantastic. It'll be made available through the Agrihive website, and also for those that have registered, you will probably get an email if you haven't done so already. There will be one winging its way to you again. And we'll have prizes for the categories that you see on the screen there. The competition will run to the end of January, when we'll then effectively judge and distill the inputs and feedback and come up with a wider feedback to put back out to the industry. Rob?
Yeah, I think broadly in terms of the competition, that's what we would like, as many ideas as we can. And I think, we want to cover some of the issues that we think perhaps aren't talked about too much or are swept under the carpet a little bit. So in terms of some of the things that we see as maybe stifling businesses and maybe not making farming, and particularly dairy farming as well, not quite as dynamic as some of the other businesses we see, are maybe some of the sort of things that farmers are fighting most to keep, but whether they're there or not. So Neil, I think, had a few views on subsidy payments and reliance.
And I suppose ultimately the starting point for this for me is, our farming professionals and industry representation really doing farmers a disservice with some of the advice that's given and the way that actually drives decision making. In a lot of units I go to, and I'm sure Rob sees the same, and any advisors in the audience, there's a lot of decisions that aren't necessarily commercial but get made around about trying to keep this thing up here, subsidy. And actually quite a lot of those decisions become relatively non-commercial just to try and keep this payment. And actually, if you look at the wider, bigger picture for some of these farms, and we've been in some who actually have just said, right, I'm not going to have that payment now. It's actually hindering my commercial activities. But I think as an industry, we are still driven very much by that subsidy payment and what it means to us, without actually having a real good handle on what does it actually do for my individual business. So that distorts certainly a lot of commercial decision making that we see. Rob, I'm going to let you talk about tax because I have no idea about tax. Probably shouldn't representing accountants and tax advisors, but we just wonder as well, are there certain things that farmers and probably the industry are perhaps partly complicit in that don't encourage farmers to be quite as dynamic? So, I know at the moment there's pretty much all accountants, lawyers, land agents are advising farmers how to try and ensure that they retain a bit of inheritance tax relief on a house, which inevitably drives people to probably not do things in a purely commercial way. Now, it would be much easier if we didn't have things like that impacting on businesses. Now, whether that means you tax something completely or you don't have any tax doesn't really matter, but it comes back to the same sort of thing as subsidy. We've got certain issues driving businesses or being, people being advised to do things that aren't really driving the commercial dynamism in that industry. So we see a lot of farms being grass-let, dog and sticked to try and protect a few little inheritance tax rules, when realistically, as an industry, we could probably do with all those businesses being farmed. So we need some, I think, in terms of subsidy, as Neil said, whether it's tax, there are issues that broadly are probably hindering the
the way that farming works in terms of making it dynamic enough, but we're all probably complicit in lobbying to maintain them. So, just where we go with that. And likewise, the whole capital value of farm assets now is a real issue and a drag on the industry. It's very difficult to buy more land. It's very difficult to invest. So it does mean that we perhaps see the status quo maintained. Anyone that's got a lot of capital behind them is quite a nice safe bet from the bank's perspective, presuming they generate some cash. But that the amount of capital that's involved in farms is broadly getting to the point where it makes it difficult to do things quickly, and it's also probably preserving and encouraging people to hang on where perhaps they shouldn't do. So I think we wanted some of these issues to come out of the case study and generate some discussion, and hopefully, whether the industry as a whole should be maybe taking a different view on some of these issues going forward.
I think in that final point, is a bit about the funding, how farms are financed and funded, and how we can look at that. The traditional route clearly has been through banks. Are there some other more non-traditional routes that might be there? And I think we've got a gentleman on the panel this afternoon that might help us out with some of those kind of things. Just some different thinking about how we might finance and look at some of these activities.
So I think we've sort of covered a little bit of this morning from Chris and from Alan. I think we've got to get a bit of probably some realism and some common sort of purpose in the industry, I think, more than anything. We're sort of sat in a position where we are all looking at supermarket cost of production prices at 30p, and pretty much every farmer that doesn't have one wishes they did. But there's also the issue that realistically, for a large proportion of what we're producing, which has been alluded to by previous speakers, is that actually going to be competitive? I think, who was it quoted David Dobbins? Somebody did this morning. But he also said the other day that, they would anticipate a standard price or a long-term price for farmers to be working to of about 36 euro cents, which, depending on currency fluctuations, could be anything from 22p or 23p to 30p. So we've got to work out where we do think the industry stands. What should farmers be trying to get the cost to? How are we looking at those prices? What currency are they in? What's the currency risk outside of that for the people that don't have an aligned contract? And I don't know what the answer is, but I think it's important for the industry to come up with those sort of numbers, so farmers that are sat there trying to run their businesses can actually say, if I can't deliver that, I can make decisions, and if I can deliver that, then I know where I stand. But at the moment, everybody ducks the issue about what somebody should be aiming for as a cost of production. Farmers on the ground are all trying to get it down, but I think the industry is scared to say where they think that figure should be, and that's probably something that we need to nail our colours to the mast. Can we reduce volatility? Don't think anyone's given us an answer this morning. It's here to stay. We will have years when we make losses, and we will have years when we make big profits. As Alan alluded to, if you can pile up cash when it's good, that hopefully brings you through. So we need to really drive this. We've got a lot of people arguing for processing. And there are plenty of people around the UK looking to increase processing capacity or improve processing and modernise it. But one of the issues will be a lot of that processing capacity is going to be into products that potentially won't end up on a UK shelf. So if we're doing that, we're effectively looking to where we can compete. And I just think that if we keep sending a message out to the UK processing sector that we need 30p or 40 euro cents or 42 euro cents to produce milk, there's a danger they won't build any processing capacity in the UK. We need a competitive industry that can deliver in line with what people in Ireland are producing at, so that we can encourage the likes of processors over there to invest here and build our dairy industry as well. So they're the sort of things we need to be shouting about rather than trying to brush under the carpet.
Yeah, I think for the Kidworth family. Will there be any tools available at the farm gate to help them manage some of this volatility and manage some of the risks? Because at the moment, there's very, very few things available to the farmer to actually help them cope with what's going on. So can we find some of these things? And should the processing industry also be playing a part in this to try and help at the farm gate? And I'd be very interested to hear any views around about what processors can do with farmers, because we're all part of the same bigger industry, to help manage some of that risk. But equally for farming, as Rob said, to try and drive further investment from processors, I think we do just need to get to the point where, if our euro competitors can do it comfortably for 35 euro cents, which today is about 24.5 pence, then we need to be able to do that as well. Certainly to cope with those global markets that we get much more involved in. Rob.
Yeah, will any of this be enough? I think William alluded to, he looked through the case study to find out what the cost of production was, and there wasn't a nice big figure saying this is what my cost of production is. I think there's a huge issue in terms of what people understand by cost of production. The supermarket prices at 30p include a little bit of profit element or extra money returns on bits and pieces, but whatever we're doing, many farmers don't understand where they're at. I mean, the case study that we're looking at, there's years in there where the business makes quite good money, but actually, most people that are running smaller farm businesses are running them through partnerships and sole trader businesses. They're taking their drawings and tax out after the bottom line. So when they look at the profit and think that's what they've made, they've forgotten that they've got to then live. And that's a big issue. And we see, I work in a firm of accountants where we often get the question, well, you're telling me I made 50,000 quid, where is it? Because I don't have it anywhere. And basically they've spent it. So it's understanding what you need to include in those costs, which I think a lot of people aren't. I think there's a whole multitude of people who talk about costs of production. Probably we could do with a very straightforward industry standard figure that everyone used. I'm not too bothered about imputed figures because people need to know what it costs on their farm, and every farm is different. But we need to let farmers understand what it is and get them to really know where they sit. There is a huge variation. We only have to look at, the Tesco moves alluded to by Chris, and we do have a panel member after who probably knows all about them, but obviously sworn to secrecy or he'll be shot. There is a big variation. We've got Booth's farmers in Lancashire and Cumbria getting 32 or 34p, and yet we've got other people on 14. We've got that massive swing in costs. Booths are saying that Tesco's come up with a cost of production at 30p. We've got clients who last year, if I remember back to our 14 figures, I think we had our best people were probably producing it in the very low 20s down towards 20 pence, and the very worst people were at nearly 40. Now some of those at nearly 40 have actually gone out of business, and some of them are still here, surprisingly. But there is a massive variation people need to get to. And I think one of the things that we're all perhaps a little bit scared to talk about is potentially where that comes in terms of improving cost of production through economies of scale. And probably the biggest driver of economies of scale is not whether you've got more cows and less feed or a bit less fertiliser or a bit less bank charges. The biggest thing that drives economies of scale that I see is just family drawings against the number of cows they're milking. If you produce 1 million litres of milk and draw £50,000 out, it's 5 pence a litre. If you produce 4 million litres of milk, it's only 1.25 pence per litre. That is a huge issue, and that is what's probably driving most of the cost out of farms, getting scale driven down to one family drawing out of it. And that's something that we need to be honest about and look at and make sure that people understand where they sit and how they are competing.
Okay, thanks, Rob. And another thing I think the case study throws up is back to this land ownership thing we touched on earlier. You know, in the Kidworth case study, we've got this valuable asset that's actually struggling to generate cash. We've got this huge balance sheet net worth that's really, well, as Rob said, you know, when you look at the figures actually in cash terms, just going backwards, dying a slow death, I suppose you could say. But it's also going to become a burden when it comes to succession planning as well. So it's not actually helping you make any significant cash. It's going to become a pain when it comes to sorting it out with the next generation. So I suppose the thing is, you know, should we be looking at land ownership in a different way than we do at the moment? Rob, do you have the answer?
I don't have an answer. I know, you know, it's certainly an issue because people do look at land ownership and the value that's tied up in it and worry about passing it down to generations. But when you actually look at, you know, if you look at the return on land generally, it doesn't generate a lot. You know, rents have always returned about 2% yield on land. So it's not a huge earner. It provides a lot of benefits which can be held from a capital perspective. But I think we need to, when you look at trading businesses that run well, they can generally generate very good returns on top of that land, which is why tenants sometimes do phenomenally well. And also why we get good businesses that potentially don't necessarily always rush to buy land. You know, we've got to, you know, land's almost a sort of place to hide your money when you've made it, but it's not the way of generating the cash in the first place. But I think we need to get the burden away from treating farms being passed down or people running farms as having to have the land with them. You know, we might end up with a lot more landowners and a lot more landlords if we've got family members who are potentially split farms up and provide equity to people for owning it but not actually running the business. And I think splitting the business from the land potentially makes a lot of that easier. But, you know, we'll listen to views afterwards, hopefully. And I think in terms of doing that, whose job is it to try and get some of this, you know, aired? Where do we go? Is it an issue? I can't remember who'd been talking about trying to deal with succession by splitting land and the business a week or two back. It was in one of the papers, but I can't think which, and I couldn't find it when I was looking for it. But it is an issue that probably wants talking about, and as capital values increase, it becomes more and more a big problem in terms of dealing with succession when you've got huge capital values that you're not that keen on dealing with. And the other thing is probably back onto some of the issues that both William and Alan raised earlier. You know, do we have the right people running businesses? You know, it's very difficult. A lot of these are very small family businesses with 2 or 3 children, and it's often very nice just to let all of them have a share in the business. But quite brutally, we probably need people that are capable of running those businesses. I mean, I act for a couple of partnerships with people in them who probably should never have been partners. And it stifles those businesses in the future. So we need to think a lot more about when we're introducing partners and how we're building businesses. You know, we need how we choose between family and doing that. Do we need to be more focusing on picking successors on merit rather than on age or sex, which seems to be the sort of general historic approach to the equation? And can that bring in outside skills? You know, most of the best businesses I see now, I suppose, are probably run by fairly highly educated people. Most that have been through a higher education qualification, they've come back in the farming. I think what we do need to do is, if we're trying to retain these people in farm businesses, we need to try and drag them back from university when they've gone, and don't let them get too swayed by the bright lights of the city. Which is not necessarily an easy task depending on where you live, but you know, it's trying to get enough people of that caliber back into the industry, and it doesn't happen overnight. You know, most of it's probably generational. You can't suddenly turn yourself from being a guy who left school at 14 and never travelled the world or did anything to a world travelling student with a PhD in something. So we want people that have got skills, and we just, you know, should we be really being a bit more brutal about that on farms and trying to ensure that we do have good people running them?
Yeah, actually, I think my best part in that as well. Still, too many farms I go to, son, daughter will be outside working. They're maybe going to be part of the business. They might even be part of the business, but it's still mum and dad that speak to the bank manager, and you really don't get a feel for what's coming behind. Ultimately, from a banker's point of view, I lend to the people who run that farm. I don't lend to the farm. I don't lend to the land. I don't lend money to the cows. I lend money to the people. They need to demonstrate to me that they are going to have the long-term skills to pay me my money back without needing to put a for sale sign up, which nobody in this industry wants to do. So, and that brings us on, are management skills good enough? No idea. On far too many farms, I go on, Rob will go on, I have absolutely no idea if the management skills really are good enough. And that just takes time. But it also means that, we need to be supporting farms and farm businesses to get people off, get them away, tour the world, see other businesses, join discussion groups, benchmarking, all of these kind of things, which I think probably still a tiny portion of the industry actually do. So, Rob, I get the feeling it's lunchtime.
Sounds right to me.
Have a wee chat about this. And after lunch, there'll be a chance, if the audience, any in the audience want to ask questions, Rob and I will be here for another 15 minutes. If you've got no interest in asking us any questions, that's great. Jack can start a little bit earlier.